Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Torquil Duthie. I'm an associate professor of Japanese literature in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA, and I will be serving as moderator for this roundtable discussion. This is one of two virtual roundtables that together will constitute the call for papers for the Association for Japanese Literary Studies 28th Annual Conference at UCLA in the spring of 2022. The theme of the conference is Turning Points. The conference was originally scheduled for March of this year, 2021, but as early as last summer, we realized that we were going to have to postpone for a year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. As my colleagues and I at UCLA were thinking of what to do in the interim, we came up with the idea of, rather than simply sending out a call for papers consisting of a typical brief statement explaining the general theme of the conference and suggesting some questions and topics, we would organize two roundtables in which a group of scholars would respond to the theme of the conference and engage in a discussion. And that this discussion itself would serve as a call for papers that would be collaborative, multi-voiced, and include a range of different perspectives and approaches to the theme. We hope that the two roundtable discussions are useful and thought-provoking to anyone who is thinking of applying to give a paper at the Turning Points AJLS conference at UCLA, as well as to anyone else who is involved in the field of Japanese literary studies. Needless to say, our discussion is not meant to be and cannot possibly be comprehensive, and we also look forward to receiving applications for papers on topics that we have overlooked or not covered in our discussions here. Before introducing our panelists, I'd like to briefly outline the conference theme. By turning points, we mean historical moments of deep social and cultural transformation in which available forms of linguistic and literary expression are perceived as no longer adequate to describe new realities. Some obvious examples of such turning points are the founding of the early Japanese state and the production of the earliest extant mythological and literary texts in the 8th century, the Genpei Wars in the late 12th century and their aftermath, the founding of the Tokugawa shogunate and the development of urban print culture in the 17th century, the Meiji Restoration and the establishment of industrial capitalism, the post-war aftermath of empire, post-3/11 literature, and perhaps our present moment of the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are many other ways of conceiving of a turning point. In its broadest sense, the conference theme asks, what is the relationship between literature and historical change in Japan? More specifically, it asks how literary texts respond to and participate in moments of historical rupture in which the future appears uncertain. How, in the process of representing crisis, do literary texts articulate different kinds of social identities and envision alternative forms of collectivity? How do literary texts shape the transformation of people's sense of social reality at certain historical moments? And last but not least, what role does literary writing play in the historical representation of certain moments of the past as turning points? In addition to these and other questions, the conference also welcomes reflections on our present moment as a turning point in the field and on how we might imagine the future of Japanese literary studies. I would like to turn now to introduce our four speakers. I have asked each of them to present some initial thoughts on the conference theme for about 10 minutes. Before we move to a general discussion. Our first presenter is Michael Bordash, who is Robert S. Ingersoll Professor of Japanese Literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Our second speaker is Satoko Shimazaki, who is Associate Professor of Japanese Literature and Theater in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Our third presenter is Vijayanti Selinger, who is Stanley F. Druckenmiller Associate Professor of Asian Studies at Bowdoin College. And our fourth speaker is David Lurie, Associate Professor of Japanese History and Literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Columbia University. Each presenter will speak in the order that I have introduced them, beginning with Michael Bordash.
Thank you, Torquil. I'm delighted to be here. And as the modernist on the panel, I thought it was a very good idea to have me go first because I won't be able to keep up with the conversation when my esteemed colleagues move on to early modern, medieval, classical, and ancient periods. But I think I was invited here to think primarily about the Meiji period and how we thought about Meiji literature as occupying a kind of turning point. I'm always reminded of one of the very first conference presentations I did in 1994 at the Fukuoka UNESCO Association meeting. I presented on Shimazaki Tosan's Before the Dawn in terms of national history and how in the novel, the historical break of the Meiji Restoration and the violence that accompanied it were narrated in terms of national ideology as an instance of peaceful continuity and an unbroken linear history of the nation. And after I finished my presentation, an older Japanese scholar asked me a question about how historical discontinuities are also ideological constructs. He pointed out that, yes, that the narratives of unbroken historical continuity are always in the service of political interests, but that narratives of discontinuity also are in the service of political interests in the present. And it was a terrific question that I'm still trying to answer 30 years later. I was trained in the late 1980s and the early 1990s to be suspicious of claims for unbroken historical continuity. This was a generation that was very much involved in the critique of Orientalism with its construction of an ahistorical East, the critique of modernization theory with its stress on Japanese tradition as a source of developmental continuity. And we were also, of course, very critical of the Cold War roots of East Asian studies in the context of the Vietnam War, anti-communism, and other ideological factors that led to the rise of area studies. So I was part of a generation that was trained to look for concealed breaks hidden behind facades of continuity. This was, of course, the era of Foucault's notion of epistemic ruptures. It was also the era of Hobsbawm and Ranger's book on inventions of tradition that was very influential. And in scholarship on Japanese literature and history, this was the era of Karatani Kojin's Origins of Modern Japanese Literature, of Maidai's scholarship on the rise of the modern reader, of Ueno Chizuko's work on the rise of modern discourses of gender and sexuality. This is the era of the rediscovery of Tosaka Jun and his notions of temporality involving qualitative leaps and breaks rather than quantitative progress. So this was the generation in which I was trained. From the start, there were critiques of this stress on Meiji as a temporal break with the past. Kame Hideo's book, Transformations of Sensibility, which is now available online in a free open access edition, took an approach that was very critical of Karatani and others and looked for a more gradual process of transformation using Hegelian and phenomenological models in which past forms were sublated, which is to say that they were overcome but also retained in new syntheses. And we've seen in recent years much scholarship rethinking the periodization of Meiji literature, looking at what some scholars call the long 19th century that stretches from the late 18th century into the opening decades of the 20th century. For instance, work that looks at the continuing impact of Edo period fiction or of Ming and Qing dynasty fiction from China on Meiji literature. And again, I think of Kame Hideo as an instance of this, and I'm thinking of his book on Tsubuchi Shoyo's Shosetsu Shinzui, in which he stresses not so much how Shoyo broke with the Edo period notions of literature advocated by writers like Bakin, but rather how much Shoyo's thinking and vocabulary carried Bakin's ideas into the Meiji period. We've also, I think, since the turn of this century, seen an increasing tendency to absorb Meiji literature into the classical canon. For instance, editions like the Shin Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei now include Meiji period works. My own department, we're just concluding a search for a new assistant professor in what probably would originally have been called pre-modern Japanese literature, but we redefined as pre-1900 Japanese literature, again, including the Meiji period in the classical period. So we've seen an increased tendency to stress the continuity of Meiji with preceding periods, which in some cases implies that the real turning point must have come sometime later than 1868. Perhaps the real turning point came in 1895 or 1910 or 1912 or 1925 or 1945. I'm remembering Sensei in Soseki's Kokoro and the strong sense he has in 1912 of meeting the end of an era at the time of his death. And we've seen other scholarship that implies that there never really was a sharp turn in the Meiji period. And as that questioner at the Fukuoka conference in 1994 pointed out to me, whenever we locate, whether we locate breaks or continuities looking at the Meiji period, we're always doing this in service of our present moment and whatever it is we think the present moment needs. Nonetheless, those of us that are working on this period need to deal with the fact that the Meiji did see the rise of unprecedented forms that were perceived at the time as constituting radical breaks. Whenever I teach Meiji literature, I always bring in facsimiles of the first editions of Tsubushi Shoyo's Shosetsu Shinzui, published in 1885 and 1886, and Futabate Shimei's Ukigomo, published a couple of years later. The two works are only a couple of years apart, and they're always thought of as a kind of pair. But when you look at them, they come from radically different publishing formats. Shoyo's Shosetsu Shinzui looks very much like an Edo period publication. It's printed on one side of the pages. The pages are folded in half, and then they're sewn at the binding. Whereas Futabate's Ukigomo looks very much like a modern book, so that in a very short period of time, something dramatic has obviously happened in the physical format of the text that people were reading. The Meiji period brought with it new technologies of reading, new forms of economy, new forms of citizenship, and of course, the very notion of literature in our modern sense as an object of academic study and of aesthetic cultural production is itself very much a Meiji invention. I've just finished a book on Natsume Soseki that rethinks his fiction and his literary theories as a creative and critical response to the rise of a new modern property regime in Japan, a dramatic shift in Meiji in the practices and ideologies of ownership. There is, of course, some continuity with earlier Edo periods of practices of ownership, but those continuities themselves are embedded in a radically new system of property ownership. And as I was writing the book, I was struggling with what kind of language I should use to describe this turning point. And I experimented in the book with using the word translation to think about what happened when pre-existing practices of ownership were re-embedded into a new property regime. I said that they were translated. Other scholars have experimented with different expressions. Kame Hideo, of course, used transformations, henkaku. Other models that we see use include the idea of adaptation, vernacularization, repetition with difference. Our conference is using the phrase turning point, which is a lovely phrase that implies both continuity and discontinuity. It has a very subtle nuance to it. But each of these expressions provides a different conception of what happened in the Meiji period. And in doing so is responding to the demands of our present day situation in different ways and trying to think about literature and culture from the Meiji period. And as I think about this issue, I'm still wrestling with that question that I was given in the 1994 conference. And I very much look forward to hearing how my co-panelists have also responded to this prompt. So I'll pass the torch to the next speaker now.
I'm excited to be joining this roundtable with people whose work I have always found very inspiring. My role, I take it, is to consider the notion of turning points from my perspective as someone who researches in the area of Tokugawa or early modern literary and theater studies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin with a discussion of turning points specifically in the context of early modern literature and theater studies in the hopes that this may encourage people to propose paper in these areas. And then I'm going to move on to discuss the concept of the turning point itself as something that is constantly evolving and productively incomplete. And hopefully that would resonate with some things that Michael has already mentioned. So I would like to start by observing that it seems kind of hard to pinpoint a particular event or moment in the context of early modern Japan that really shredded the fabric of everyday life the way other major points of rupture did. And I'm thinking of things like the Genpei War or the Meiji Restoration or World War II. And this may have something to do with the way the early modern period has been figured as a repository of tradition ever since the Meiji period, as Carol Gluck shows so clearly in her essay, The Invention of Edo. When I look back at the social changes that took place during this period, it strikes me that it might be more accurate to speak not about a turning point, but of a turning blob, because it's so hard to identify where things start and end. Is it even possible to identify a threshold or to say when it was crossed? This ambiguity applies, for instance, to the rise of print culture, the rise of commercial woodblock print, which is, of course, one of the most important transformations to occur during this period. People often speak of a print revolution, but what we actually see is a long, gradual epistemological change that was bound up with a thriving manuscript culture, the mass dissemination of paper, and the emergence of a diversified book market. Over time, print did alter people's sense of space and temporality by helping to spread news, making visible the social rankings of households, even disseminating knowledge about celebrity salaries. And I think of one interesting example is performances on stage that get subject to the pull of print as commodity, as we see in the development in kabuki of emen no mie, which is picturesque poses that aim to turn the stage into an ukiyo-e print. Print becomes an important connecting tissue for early modern society, and above all for urban spaces, but it's a transition that happens very slowly. You might also say that print technology reorganized knowledge of earlier periods, as texts that had formerly circulated privately among a select circle of intellectuals were made available to a wider public. The tale of Genji circulated in the form of Kitamura Kigin's Kogetsho, which brought together interpretations from earlier commentaries and continued to be read and cited in Japan until the mid-20th century. And then, of course, there are all those vernacularizations and popularizations of classical and Sino-Japanese works. With respect to these sort of texts, the early modern period might be regarded as a turning point simply on account of all the textual reproductions and reconstitutions that took place. Frequently, it serves as a filter through which we access the past. Some canonical Heian period works only survive in Tokugawa copies, print or manuscript, for instance, and yet they, of course, end up in the Heian section of a literary anthology. Another point worth noting when one thinks about turning blobs in the roughly 250 year span of the early modern period is that there's a sort of pervasive lag in the way cultural expressions become part of city spaces, especially during the first half of the period. Genres don't change at the same pace. And I'm thinking of things like Sekkyo and Kojo-ruri, that's deeply kind of embedded in a aesthetic and sense of the medieval period. It still retains a sense of itinerancy, even when they're brought to the urban stage and kind of just disappears in urban productions. Certain narrative texts produced in Kamigata at the end of the 17th century and early in the 18th century, and I'm thinking works like Ihara Saikaku, publications put out by Hachimonjiya, seem much more attuned to the reality of urban growth and contemporary aesthetics than, for instance, early Edo Kabuki, which was invested in military lineages, exaggerated expressions of strength, and featuring godly protectors for the military community. So in my view, then, the early modern period asks us to think in terms of multiple, overlapping, competing turning points, each specific to particular communities and particular regions or localities. I also think that scale is important in thinking about turning points. We often find ourselves working within a national framework, but of course, turning points can be located in a global or planetary perspective too. And I'm sure this applies to other periods as well, but in researching early modern Japan, we quickly start to bump up against issues of translations and the belatedness of the study of Japan vis-a-vis the study of Europe. The term early modern is itself tied to a European perspective on European historical periodization that is only partially applicable to Japan under Tokugawa rule. And the same is true of all sorts of other terms and ideas. The notion of global as a subjective category that presumes the existence of centers and peripheries, or the concept of maritime trade, the map, imperialism and expansion, and even print and the circulation of knowledge. All these brings with them certain assumption. So the vocabulary is already saturated. The work we do tends all too easily to be framed by turning points that derive from contexts that don't necessarily connect all that comfortably with the materials we research. How do we deal with this situation without retreating into a sort of isolation? Perhaps we need to bring about a turning point in the way we think about turning points themselves to create the potential for new, less Eurocentric forms of knowledge. And now I want to move on to just talking about the second point, the ephemerality, provisionality, and incompleteness of turning points. I think there are definitely moments when one feels oneself to be at a turning point. We are probably living in one such moment right now. But setting aside this somewhat unusual situation, I think that on a deeper level, turning points are always connected to the present, as Michael already beautifully pointed out. The turning point is a metaphor that helps us structure and thus take control of messy, sprawling expanses of time and space. In our field, we talk about linguistic turns or spatial turns in the humanities, or about the planetary turn, which has become especially important, I think, after 3/11. Each of these new lenses or tools, methodologies, is in some ways conditioned by the moment we occupy and make visible new meanings. When I was conducting research for my first book, Edo Kabuki in Transition, which focused on kabuki productions in the city of Edo, the 1920s emerged as an important moment in my narrative because that was when crucial critical editions of plays by two playwrights, Tsuruya Namboku and Kawatake Mokuami, were created and anthologized. These texts came to be regarded as more authoritative than the ephemeral practices of knowledge transmission that had long characterized Edo Kabuki and been one of its most, which for a long time been one of its most important functions. So I needed to revisit this moment in order to rethink my methodology and the tools I was using to study early modern theater, especially since I wanted to engage with precisely the function that had been transformed in the process of kabuki's textualization. The turning point I discovered in the 1920s appeared to me as a turning point because of the nature of the research that I was doing. So we begin with turning points that have been positioned by earlier scholars. Because turning points are metaphors that organize our knowledge, they're always incomplete, waiting to be rewritten, and they should be rewritten. We have to continue to ask new questions that complicate the fixity of the event, change, or rupture. So I want to conclude by saying that to me, the turning point seems to stand as an open-ended space of inquiry without fixed meaning, a place that is waiting to be discovered, a place we can and should revisit again and again as new perspectives become available to us. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jayanthi Selinger, and I'm part of this panel because my work focuses on how literature is transformed by the birth of warrior power. So my remarks today are divided into three parts. In the first, I describe how my own past research has tried to look past continuities to ask instead what things need to be absented in order to secure political or historical continuities. In the second, I draw from my current research to describe what I sense are new literary vocabularies that I think emerged in the medieval period, again, under the birth of warrior power. In the third, I make a case for using literary case studies from the medieval period to think about what I'll be calling the rhetoric of temporality. So I've spent the past decade thinking broadly about vernacular historical writing, by which I mean narrative representations of the past not found in official chronicles or court diaries. That is, my focus has been the Heike Monogatari. And given that my focus was retrospections of the past, I had to think about whether I saw any sharp breaks in this corpus consistent with the tumultuous birth of warrior power? Or was I seeing more ideas of overlays? Now, approach that question from the standpoint of political vision about historical change, and the tales of the Heike do depict warriors as a sort of disruptive force, but at the same time, dutiful aristocrats. Approach that question from figuration, and we notice the courtly sensibilities of the Taira clan, in part influenced by the cultural climate of the 14th century, where Muromachi shoguns sought to highlight their aristocratic chops. Approach it yet another way from the question of genre, and the tales of the Heike continue in their depiction of death, the Buddhist genre of Ojōden, focusing on the salvific final moments of warriors. Finally, approach it through the literary language about travel and exile, and here too we see a notable continuity. This brief summary focuses on continuity because our typical anchoring points, or maybe mine, were genre, political history, religious history, or literary history. And when we use those anchoring points, we are directed towards seeing continuities. But as we change our case studies, I believe new perspectives emerge. Some of my favorite questions are what things are absented so as to depict historical change. In my book, I argued that the Yoba famine needed to be absented in the tales of the Heike to evoke historical continuity, a deliberate silence about the loss of authority of the court caused by the war. In a recent article, I asked if the absence of blood on the battlefield also helps secure continuity by removing troubling sanguinary excess, by preventing the marking of foes as being unworthy of spiritual salvation. Other questions fellow scholars that inspire me are asking are, what about depictions of material objects that play a suasive effect in shaping meaning? Here I'm thinking about Edith Serra's work on houses as both a physical space and a literary metaphor of lineage in the Tale of Genji. So new eras bring new objects and new material environs. And this new focus on thingology illuminates both how objects informed and transformed pre-modern rhetoric. And I'd like to speak to Michael's comments about property later by making a connection. In my current work, I'm looking at another transformation. I'm looking at how no plays represent legal discourses. The legal arena is not a thing per se, but a novel institution that develops during the medieval period. We typically see no drama as pageantry for shoguns. In such readings, we tend to see continuities, the courtly past evoked in no drama as a kind of overlay, a temporal overlay for the Muromachi present. And that ends up directing our scholarly attention to elusive uses of courtly idioms and elusive uses of the past in a kind of temporal overlay. But I am looking instead at present time or genzai no plays, which function as vernacular legal writing. The very fact that these plays have to contend with imprisonment, capture, or the failure of justice on stage gives us a new vision of no drama focused on the non-elite, replete with new idioms of social vulnerability or judicial blindness. If no drama is newly concerned with freedom and unfreedom, themes deeply resonant with the social status of its performers, how does that change our perception of no drama's literary inheritance from Heian literature? How can we think of no drama as a kind of turning point instead of a pageantry which performs a temporal overlay? So as you might have noticed, I'm thinking of the ways in which the past is layered onto the present in Muromachi Japan. So I have long thought about the elaborate figurative mechanisms in medieval prose to establish analogical correspondences between past and present. Typically, we call this allegory. In no plays, the great Heian poet of the great Heian past of the Engi era allegorically evokes the Muromachi present. I see this in my own research in no plays, where Tokiyori's sage role as a judge is evoked in 15th century no place, a 13th century figure in a 15th century no place. How does the evocation of a 13th century Tokiyori function in these 15th century no place? Is his figure simply the evocation of a hallowed past that continues or is overlaid onto the present? All such language of simultaneity is, as de Man argues, a rhetoric of temporality. That is, it points to the articulation of a temporal predicament, a kind of hand-wringing about the relationship between the past and the present. And in this rhetoric of temporality, is the past rhetorically synthesized with the present through allegory, or severed from the past by means of irony, as de Man theorizes? Now, even if we grant that we don't have much irony in the medieval period, even if we grant that medieval literature trends towards allegory, the dense rebus puzzles that we have to use to access the past, as Susan Klein argues in her new book, inevitably betray gaps in knowledge about the past that have to be filled in, thus betraying the pastness of the past. So some of the things I think about is how we might use the next conference to think about the rhetoric of temporality. How did writers inscribe their own positions within spans of time? Did they describe the fracturing of time or write it in terms of palimpsestic overlays? Do they only show us acts of remembering, or do they show themselves forgetting? What is the temporality of a dream or a prophetic vision? Do dreams and prophetic visions not complicate the teleology of a past, present, and future in ordered sequence by implying the future in the present or the past in the present? And what is used to mark the passage of time? Is it death? Is it disease? Is it seasons? Is it epochs? Is it degradation of the built environment? And what remains timeless? Objects? So on that note, I'll conclude my remarks.
It's an enormous honor to be a part of this group, and I'm really grateful to Torkel and the other organizers for giving me the opportunity. I have been listening to these three incredibly stimulating and rich presentations and thinking that I'm not sure how much point there is for me to go when so much has already been said. But I was also thinking about all of the kind of points of connection and overlap with some of the things that I wanted to talk about. So I will carry on and look forward to discussing all of these connections after my remarks are finished. So I want to talk about the 12th century as a philological turning point. In The Language of Gods and the World of Men from 2006, Sheldon Pollock emphasizes the importance of literarization, by which he means the various processes through which a given written language becomes a medium for literature. And one of these processes is something that he terms philologization, which is the development of metalinguistic practices and disciplines for the interpretation and transmission of valued texts and genres. Philologization, which is more concretely the emergence of grammars, lexicons, poetic treatises, commentaries, and the like, is a crucial but underappreciated component of Pollock's model of the emergence of vernacular literary languages that are first superimposed on a pre-existing trans-regional cosmopolitan language and eventually come to replace it. Now, when these ideas are applied to East Asian countries with their long and rich employment of the literary Sinitic cosmopolitan register, we notice something very interesting. Although there is some degree of scholarly attention to vernacular languages and texts written in them in pre-modern Korea and Vietnam, it is only in Japan that thoroughgoing philologization can be said to have taken place before the late 19th century. Why is that? Now, of course, such a complex question is unlikely to have a simple answer, but the explanation that interests me most involves a strong claim about a certain kind of turning point. I believe that the philologization of Japanese as a literary language can be traced to the 12th century. This is not to say that there are no relevant earlier developments, and neither is it to claim that the process occurred all at once. And I think this is point where there's a lot of overlap in my sense of what a turning point is with my co-panelists. I don't see a turning point as a kind of big bang where something emerges ex nihilo, but as more akin to a hinge or a pivot that connects earlier and later developments. So I'm making an argument for the 12th century as a kind of philological hinge or pivot. Now, with good reason, any reference to grammars, lexicons, poetic treatises, commentaries, and so on that are devoted to vernacular literature in Japan is likely to remind us of the scholars of the Edo period who we somewhat anachronistically refer to as kokugakusha. They are often treated as intellectual revolutionaries who broke with pre-existing medieval traditions of commentary and scholarship. And of course, this is another turning point, and not an illusory one. But I think one that I increasingly think one that has been significantly overstated. And in a sense, we're taking the PR of people like Kamo no Mabuchi and Motori no Norinaga seriously, or at least a little too seriously, if we see them as radically breaking with their predecessors. When we look for them, we can see that there are equally important continuities, connections to an earlier tradition that the Kokugaku scholars themselves acknowledge quite openly. And as a case in point, I want to share with you a passage from Norinaga's Zuitsu Tamagatsuma. So in a book called Chitoseyama Shu, Ando Tameakira praises Keichu's commentary on the Manyoshu, writing that compared to this great priest, we can say that the likes of Kenjo and Sengaku are no better than plodding nags. This certainly seems to be true. Compared to the earlier theories of Kenjo and others, anyone must have thought that Keichu's explications were exhaustive, leaving no points to be added. But now, when compared to our great master Agatai, Kamo no Mabuchi that is, we see that the likes of Keichu as well should be called plodding nags. In all things, the successive generations that appear afterward are overpowering. Now, this may seem on the surface like a kind of presentation of a turning point which is not the one that I'm talking about. Since Tameakira was a student of Keichu's and Norinaga was at least nominally Mabuchi's disciple, there's kind of genealogy being proposed here, and there's a lot that we can read between the lines of these claims. I also find it amusingly and admirably typical of Norinaga that although he not too subtly implies that he himself has surpassed Mabuchi, he also leaves room for succeeding generations to overtake his own scholarship, which is in keeping with his famous admonishment to his disciples that they should correct his own mistakes. But these are not the reasons that I'm quoting this passage here. This is not the what I want to focus on in this passage. What's important here, what I really want to focus on, is that Tameakira and Norinaga both treat Kenjo, whose name is also often read Kensho, they both treat Kenjo as the fountainhead of a philological tradition. And I think we can see this philological tradition as here they're talking about the Manyoshu in particular, but I think we can take the Manyoshu as a synecdoche for the larger kind of philological tradition devoted to vernacular classics of Japan. Now, Kenjo's dates are unknown, but he was active in the late 12th century. He was a member of the Rokujo Fujiwara, a poetic lineage best known now as the rivals of the much more successful Miko Hidari house of Fujiwara no Shunzei and his son Teika. And history has not been kind to Kenjo's reputation as a poet, but his scholarly renown is another matter entirely. He wrote major treatises on waka, including the still impressive Shuchusho, and his Kokinshu commentary was so successful that even his rival Teika wrote a sub-commentary about it. But I think we can take Kenjo as another synecdoche because he's far from the only 12th century figure who is producing this kind of new scholarship. Teika himself is famous for collating manuscripts, for writing commentaries on works including the Tale of Genji, and for attempting to establish principles for spelling classical Japanese works, or kanazukai. Other pioneers of the period include Kenjo's relative Fujiwara no Kyosuke, the other Fujiwara who's not related to them, Fujiwara no Norinaga, who's the author of a very important early Kokinshu commentary, and Minamoto no Shunnai, author of the famous text Toshiori Zuino. It is these works and others of this period that inaugurate the traditions of commentary, of textual criticism, of grammatical, that is tenioha, and orthographic or kanazukai scholarship, and so on, that culminate in the early modern expansion and articulation of the interrelated subdisciplines that came to be called kokugaku. So I'm really arguing for the 12th century as this kind of point of origin for a series of interlocking streams of inquiry and linguistic thought and literary scholarship that kind of can be traced forward into the Edo period. And I would add also into the present, because there's another problematic turning point on the other side, where we could talk about the articulation between kokugaku and the disciplines of kokugogaku and kokubungaku as well. Now, why does this philological approach to Japanese literary texts written in kana emerge in the 12th century? And another way of phrasing that question is, what are the conditions that make this a turning point? Now, I don't mean to provide an exhaustive list, but here are 5 conditions. The first, waka and related prose had been canonized through imperial patronage and popularity at court for several centuries already at this point. The second, the language of these genres, especially waka, was conservative, but the spoken language of the Heian elite had diverged considerably in phonology and to some degree in syntax and vocabulary from that of several centuries earlier. This made older classics harder to understand and created great social anxiety in poets composing with those classics as models. Third, manuscripts of works like the Kokinshu and the Genji were corrupt, which added to the aforementioned interpretive difficulties. Fourth, an excellent model for philology was provided by the literary Sinitic tradition itself, which was massively intertwined with commentary and lexicography in ways that would have been hardwired into every elite male by his education. And then fifth, Sinitic modes of philology were primed for vernacular superposition by 3 key pre-existing textual traditions. And I'm sorry to have a nested list inside the list of 5, but these 3 pre-existing textual traditions that primed Sinitic philology for vernacular superposition were the institution of kundoku itself, which meant that the study of any literary Sinitic text necessarily involved an interface with the Japanese vernacular. Court lectures on the Nihon Shoki in the early to mid-Heian period, which modeled scholarly attention to a Japanese classic and produced notes that circulated, including some that were essentially glossaries linking characters and vernacular vocabulary. And then finally, the existence of the Manyoshu itself, which in addition to its high status as the fountainhead of waka, preserved a vast trove of logographically written vernacular texts, which enabled a linkage between Sinitic lexicons and commentaries and the kana vocabulary of Heian waka. Thank you.
Thank you all for such thoughtful and deeply thought-provoking remarks. As I may have mentioned earlier, I'm the moderator here, so I intend to keep my participation as low-key as possible. But I would like to perhaps just mention a few points of connection among your different presentations, and then I will sit back and let you discuss them. I think it's probably obvious from the makeup of this panel that one idea behind it was to get some representation from people working in different periods. I think from ranging from early classical to medieval, early modern and modern, and to sort of try and what I mean by modern is Meiji, essentially, into just the sort of beginning of modern, and to get some kind of representation like that. But there's also some effort of genre representation too. You'll notice Satoko works primarily on performance and in theater, and Jayanti primarily looks at historical narrative, vernacular historical narrative. Michael Bordash has done many things, but has of course worked on the novel. And David, at least today, is looking at scholarship primarily on poetry, which is the sort of the epitome of the literary genre, the central literary genre of pre-modernity. And so that is, I hope that all the periods and the sort of genres all figure in the subsequent discussion. One thing I'd like to say is in one sense, as Michael mentioned in his preliminary remarks, turning points has this sort of ambiguity to it. In one sense, you can see it as their period markers, right? Jacques Le Goff has this very amusingly titled, "Is it really necessary to cut history into slices?" The word he uses in French is tranche, which means it's like portions. Do we have to sort of cut it up and give people a different bit of it? And so a turning point is in a sense where you put a pin in a timeline to mark an end or a beginning for whatever it is that you're trying to discuss. But as Satoko's mentioned, of course, when you zoom out a little bit from your pin, you see perhaps lots of pins together and you see a blob. And I was amused by the idea of turning blobs as a kind of parody version of what this conference parody title of this conference, in some kind of late Edo Yomihon or something like that. And that would be very interesting. But of course, turning points also has a certain subjective ring to it, where people, it's something experienced that people live through. The experience, as the print call for paper says, that the future is uncertain, that something's just changed, and that can make people feel apprehensive. Also, it can be exciting in some ways. But people are aware of themselves as historical actors. And then they search for precedents. I think Jayanti talked about this. They search for analogies, or they look in history as a mirror, as the classical metaphor would be, right? The turning point is both unprecedented, and yet you're looking for precedents all the time at the same time. So I think those two sides of the sort of zooming down to the first person level, if you like, and the zoom out where we as scholars go, well, how are we going to think about our field? I think both of those elements were in your remarks. I think David's remarks, essentially, if I understand David correctly, this turning point is a kind of an origin point for vernacular literary criticism in some kind of way, which then sort of moves. There's the 12th century, and like you mentioned, there's of course the late medieval too, but then there's Edo period and print, and then late Edo, which is again quite different. And then we have things like Meiji, and then we have things like the 1920s, which are again kind of different, and post-war. So, and we get to our present moment, and we think, well, what should we be doing now? How should we be thinking about what we do now? So I hope that is also part of the discussion, the idea that what is it that we are studying, and what is the sort of apparatus and the frame that we use to study that. The other issue that I thought is key is the nature of a turning point, the idea of continuity or discontinuity as well, that both Jayanti and Michael talked about. And related to that is Satoko's observation that usually when we think of terms of national literature, we're looking at a national frame for turning points, but not all turning points, that sort of limits the way you think about the turning point. If you look at it in a more trans-regional or global frame. And also in terms of its immediate, the location of the turning point is sort of physical environment, in the urban environment, or court environment, or things like that I think is quite important. And last, the question that Jayanti raises of how turning points are rhetorically figured. How they're essentially kind of literary devices, if you like, what metaphors, Michael also raised this, what metaphors do you use to describe a change, a translation from one moment in time to another, from one space to another, a transformation. All of these are essentially sort of key metaphors for whatever narrative that we're trying to tell. So anyway, those are my just some of the connections I've seen between them. I would like to turn it over to you, whoever would like to begin and remark on some other things that other people said, and I'm happy to stand back or participate as necessary.
May I go first?
Of course.
So Mike, I'm really taken that you are taken with the fact that you're looking at property and how that transforms literature. I don't know if I'll ever get around to it, but I actually love thinking about how objects inform literary rhetoric. And here I'm thinking about, so I'm thinking about a kind of, as I heard you speak about property ownership, I was thinking about Brian Lamb's book on the things things say, and one of its opening assumptions is that for the notion of property to emerge, the thing needs to be walk out and have a life of its own. It needs to be sort of ontologically apart. And so it needs to be recognized as a thing on its own. And only then can we have ideas of property ownership. And so I think I would love papers that think about how things are perceived. Are they perceived as having an entity unto their own? Like, well, what is the prehistory of objects in literature that leads to the object walking out and having a life of its own, as Brian Lamb says. So, yeah, that was my one thought.
No, that's a really fascinating, that there's the alienability, the fact that something that one owns sort of by definition has to be alienable, though there's a long tradition of trying to think of inalienable properties that can't be alienated. And I'm thinking about David and Satoko's presentations as well, and thinking about this. One of the things that struck me, and I guess this comes out of Jayanti's presentation too, is the literary text. One of the things when we shift turning points in thinking about literary texts, in a certain sense, we alienate them from an existing framework and network of associations and ideas. And as scholars, and this, I'm thinking about Satoko's notion of we inherit a set of turning points, and as scholars, we then return the turning points and or locate different turning points. And this frees up the text that we've been working with into completely new networks that allow us to see the things that have been absented in the previous versions, that the things that have been foregrounded. And I'm really struck, for instance, how powerful the move in David's talk is of shifting our turning point from Kokugaku in the 17th and 18th century back. Suddenly that gesture sort of liberates a whole set of texts to a whole new set of questions and ideas that the existing framework of turning points didn't allow us to ask, but suddenly become very exciting and allow us to rethink these texts and do really interesting things with the text that we weren't able to do. And I saw that in Satoko's talk as well, in that notion of how we inherit turning points and then have to respin them or return them again.
I think one connection that I've just been dwelling on is I really love the way Satoko talked about the Edo period as a filter, because I know Torkel will feel sympathetic to me about this. I'm sure Jayanti too, although maybe a little bit less so, because there's not quite the same kind of Kokugaku filter interposed with the text that you've been working on as there is for the Nara period text that Torkel and I kind of cut our teeth working on. And I remember feeling a kind of shock as a graduate student that I had to spend so much time learning about Kokugaku just to get a sense of what was going on with the Kojiki or the Manyoshu, in terms of figuring out what were all these commentaries that were being quoted in the modern editions that I was consulting. But I think that the interesting thing about a filter is that a filter lets some things through and keeps some things back. So in a sense, the filter is the perfect image of this kind of combination of continuity and discontinuity that Michael started by talking about, that the filter is the thing that both preserves continuity for the things that make it through and creates discontinuity for the things that don't. So I think that's a kind of potent image for thinking about the ways in which, I think we can think about all these different sort of spatial metaphors, the hinge or various other ways of imagining a turning point, but I really like the kind of the sort of the filter image as a way of kind of trying to tie these sorts of different aspects together. And I also think that another thing that Satoko said that I really find incredibly productive is this issue of scale, because I think with scale is, I've never thought about it this way before, but scale is really intimately tied to the turning point, because different scales create different turning points. So in a sense, if you set your scale at a certain level of kind of intellectual history or history of philology, then there is a transition at the beginning of the Edo period or shortly after the beginning of the Edo period. And we can talk about there being a kind of turning point into Kokugaku. But if you pull back out to a different level of scale, then you might talk about from the 12th century to the early 20th century or to the mid 20th century, depending on, and if you go even deeper, you can see really stark contrasts between, say, the 16th century, I'm sorry, between the 17th century and the 18th century, where or between the 18th century and the 19th century, where there are, I mean, if you're just looking at like commentary on the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki or commentary on the Manyoshu, you can see fault lines or ruptures that would force you to sort of say, well, wait, maybe there's a turning point inside the Edo period. And I think this is really very much tied to the sort of scale of analysis, like how high up you are, how low down you are, how granular you're getting.
I think what we've been talking about all along is really trying to rethink what we thought we already know. And I think, Jayanti, the question that you asked about focusing on objects, I think is a really, really productive one, because even when David is talking about Kamono Mabuchi and Motori Norinaga, it seems to focus on kind of big minds and big movements. But when you think of the actual text, that might bring in a different discourse. I was really intrigued by Michael's introduction of the Ukigumo and Shosetsu Shinzui, even though they're published around the same time, in a completely differently packaged format. And then, of course, Jayanti's rethinking of No as a turning point, that it connects to a certain vernacular legal movement. I would love to hear more about that, because I have never thought about No plays in that light, that it's fascinating to think of a legal imagination as happening on a very ephemeral space, and something performative going on there.
Yeah, that actually, that connection to Janti's point about No, that makes me think about, we've been talking about two temporalities with turning points, the past and the future, in a sense. And I think what's always struck me about No is the way it sort of sits at this kind of nexus point where, as Janti was saying in her presentation, all of this kind of Heian classical work and to some extent carefully selected kind of classical Chinese material and Buddhist material, so it was all kind of flowing out of the past into No, where it becomes a kind of cultural encyclopedia, which then is moving forward into the future and flowing into later performance genres and ultimately other non-performance genres as well. But what I really love about this legal idea that you sketched out for us is that it points to the present. And it strikes me that we've never, it's hard. I mean, obviously people talk about performance, they talk about the way No was performed in, or they try to figure out the way No was performed in the Muromachi period. But it strikes me that from a literary historical perspective, rather than a kind of performance studies perspective, we've tended not to really think about them as so tied to their present moment of composition. And so I think that we could introduce that. I mean, is the turning point something which evacuates the present? Like when we create a turning point from a literary historical perspective, do we then make it impossible or difficult to see it in terms of how it's embedded in a kind of contemporary world?
In a related sort of add-on question to that, I was curious why this was not visible earlier, and then why it's visible. I mean, what do you think has allowed you to see this? What seems, it's one of those things, as soon as someone mentions it, it just seems obvious that everyone should have seen this all along, but people didn't. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on why this suddenly has when you look at this text, suddenly this is what you see.
Thank you all for those questions. It's going to be so helpful as I develop the ideas for my book. But I'd like to respond to those questions by actually pulling together David Lurie's idea of a hinge and Satoko's idea of a filter, because I do think when as I was speaking about analogical correspondences, every time I'm reading a medieval literary text, I'm looking at how that medieval text is looking through the filter of the past, or looking at the present through the filter of the past. It's always this, these two layers that are always seem to be in operation. These two temporalities that always seem to want to combine it, but in hinges as well. So when I started looking at these no plays, I looked at, as David just very insightfully pointed out, because they are not concerned with the past or stories of the past that much, but because they're concerned with these moments. I mean, one of the no plays I look at, it's a woman imprisoned on stage in that moment. It isn't a story of the past. It's taking place in the narrative present, and she's trying to do a jailbreak. Why hasn't it been studied? Because I think we are so influenced by the idea of no this classicized. We are so influenced by no as mugenno, as something that's always idealizing, aestheticizing the past, that sometimes, as David astutely pointed out, we tend to evacuate the present from no drama.
And perhaps the canonization of Zeami might also have something to do with that, with this kind of enormous presence. The other earlier no plays or earlier styles that were more popular gets kind of overshadowed.
I would love, I would love to hear papers, about how literary text, comment that David made about how literary text enact the history of the present, right? What would it look like? What would it look like for a literary text or a play to enact the history of the present, not of the past, not of the future? It's a fascinating question.
Mm.
There's another question that was raised in Satoko's presentation, and I'm going to connect 2 points that you made. One was that, as you noted, I think when we look at Edo period as a turning point, depending on the genre that you look at, you see, a very different. The blob is a different shape and moves at different speeds depending on the genre. And you also pointed out the problem that we have in dealing with the early modern period, that the very categories like early modern come from a different scale, come from a different location, but they're hard to get out of, because going to an isolated model introduces a whole set of other problems. But I'm wondering if genres are one answer to that. If sticking with specific genres of a period like the Edo period, and tracing through the both the way it acts as a filter of the past, but also as a history of the present, and mapping out a genre, it can be one way to give us an alternative to either going with categories that come from another time in another place, or categories that rely on something like the nation as an isolated entity, but as some sort of in-between source of new conceptualization of what it is we're looking at.
I think it's I think genres, problematic as it is in its own term, I think is a very useful category, because, and there are a lot of, I think, new works coming out in early modern studies trying to introduce new archives. And I think, I don't know if this applies to the study of early Japan or medieval Japan or to the study of Meiji Japan, but I feel like early modern studies or Tokugawa studies, at least in the literature side, has recently experienced a turning point, that it's a field that kind of picked up itself. Of course, there are really excellent works that have been produced, but as more people participate in that sense have kind of started fairly recently. And to me, for instance, it became much easier to teach literature of this period with the publication of Haruo Shirane's Early Modern Japanese Literature, an anthology, and that's 2002. Samuel Leiter and James Brandon's Kabuki on Stage series, the 4-volume, that's already early 2000s. And then you have Adam Kern and Sumiya Jones's an Edo anthology. So I think it's still a period that is kind of waiting for more and more people to participate in. In fact, a lot of people who were graduate students when these volumes were published, they're now junior professors or associate professors. And so it's like almost every year you have a book on early modern Japan coming out right now, trying to kind of discover new archives. And in relation to that, I also think that mass digitization of books that started happening probably around the 2000s as well, for a field that requires a comprehensive understanding of bibliography, looking at visual and material elements of the book, has really transformed the way we can deal with the materials, and even being in the United States or being in a remote locations where you can't always make a trip to the archive in Japan. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think genre is a very useful concept. I think the fact that early modern studies is kind of young in a way in terms of more people joining in has something to do with how it is being structured right now.
I wanted to, David, I wanted to respond to some of the things. When you listed these 5 reasons for the kind of philological work, you spoke about anxiety about the loss of the past, actual loss of reading modes that were disappearing, and then you spoke to a third intriguing idea of nesting. And I thought nesting. We've spoken about filters, we've talked about hinges, and I was wondering if you could speak to the kind of nesting work, and maybe speak broadly to how that might apply to other periods and concepts about temporality.
I mean, I think that this is a fundamental problem for the entirety of Japanese literary history up until, and this might be the biggest turning point of all. I mean, there's a point in the late Meiji or early Taisho period, and again, we could argue about where this happens, but where the sort of superimposition that's going on kind of definitively shifts away from Chinese sources to Western sources, and that until that happens, there's a very complicated mix at different times, but there's always some degree of modeling or influence happening, and this occurs at different levels and in different senses. Where there's the basic kind of linguistic level where you have the characters that are associated with the kunyomi, and so there's this kind of semantic kind of superimposition or interference or resonance that's happening at a very, very basic level, and that's something that I think has been emphasized in really interesting ways by a lot of Japanese language scholarship over the past several decades, is that is absolutely the case for things that are written in kana, so that the sort of resonances or interference provided by the existence of characters is not removed when you write in kana, because the characters are still sort of present through their connections to their kunyomi readings. So at a very kind of basic level, there's that. And then we can kind of, again, there's a scale issue. We can kind of scale back and talk about particular images or particular tropes or particular kind of literary topoi or particular genres. We can talk about actual allusions. We can talk about the kind of, I really like the way you introduced the notion of allegory in terms of reading. And as Torkel mentioned in his remarks, this notion of the past as a mirror, there's a kind of Chinese mirror And of course, there is a text that Aaron Brightwell has recently written about, the Kara Kagami, literally the Chinese mirror. So I think that this is, I mean, there's a sense in which there's this kind of continual sliding interface. I mean, if you want to talk about a blob, there's a kind of blobby quality to the way that these influences are occurring at different levels and at with different intensities and different speeds in different genres. But I think it's virtually impossible to find any area of literary history where this is not this kind of interaction or these sort of resonances or interferences. I mean, you can talk about them in different ways depending on what your perspective is and what your ideological investment in certain visions of purity might be. But there's no area where these are not relevant. And so this comes to the fore very dramatically in the case of philology, where on one level, the Chinese or the Sinitic philological tradition is providing a kind of basis on which this sort of new vernacular philology is being superimposed. So nobody has to sort of invent a commentary or invent a dictionary or invent any of the other apparatus, because there's a pre-existing set of Chinese texts that are serving that purpose, and you can sort of work within that framework. And so that's one sense in which this is the case, but there's also a more kind of fundamental sense in which the existence of texts like the Nihon Shoki and the Manyoshu that require a kind of pre-existing scholarship to produce a kundoku of those texts sets up kind of circuits between vernacular Japanese texts that are written in kana, like the Kokinshu or the Genji, and the Chinese pre-existing Sinitic philological tradition, so that there's a sort of lower level kind of superimposition or lower level set of connections that are going on. And this sort of, these two levels of the kind of philological genres existing as something that you can superimpose new vernacular forms of philology on top of, and the sort of written language of various kinds of, let's just call it kanbun, and then the way that kundoku kind of casts a shadow onto texts that are not written in characters also. Both of these are kind of the two engines that are driving the emergence of this philological tradition, and they really continue to drive it through the Edo period and beyond. And so in a weird way, the kind of polemicizing of people like Mabuchi and Norinaga against kind of karagokoro, or the sort of kind of Chinese erudition that they fulminate against so much, and the mirror image kind of polemicizing against kundoku by people like Sodai, like Ogyu Sodai or Dazai Shundai. These are a kind of, they're like an epiphenomenon. They're almost like an immune reaction or a sort of fever, and the real story is going on elsewhere. And I don't really think that much is actually changed by the sort of polemicizing that we see by people like that in the Edo period. But it does change. It does change eventually when you get into the Meiji period and beyond, and the nature of education changes, and people's exposure to classical Chinese texts early in their training changes, and the kind of intertext that they're referring to, and the kind of allegorizing they do with texts that they allude to, or that are the kind of filter that they're reading things through. That does change at some point, but it's a blobby change. And I think that the question is always where are you going to kind of put your thumb and press and say this is the important point, and that's going to change depending on what you're. I mean, I think this is something that Michael really got to wonderfully in his remarks, that there's a kind of investment in what do you want to get out of your arguments about continuity or discontinuity.
I think this is a good time. I'm going to ask a follow-up question of you all in that case. It's about the politics of turning points. When you have a particular narrative of history that says this point in time is important, it's because people are invested in making that point important. And you know, it might be something quite large to do with political genealogy. Why why are the Genpei Wars so important? Well, they were important, of course, in an objective sense, but it also has something to do with warrior rule going all the way up to the Edo period and things like that. Or there are smaller cases, like for instance, David's point about Kenjo and Teika. And our received narrative is Teika was just a much better poet than Kenjo, and they were rivals. But there's this other narrative about scholarship in which Teika was in essence a kind of disciple, dare I say, of Kenjo in at least one sense, even as they were rivals. So I think it depends on the turning point where you put the sort of pin in and then what your narrative is. But there are also, of course, contemporary contested turning points. No, this is a turning point. No, this is not, because different people are invested in them. And they can occur simultaneously as well as Michael pointed out at the beginning, the next generation coming along and undoing the previous generation's turning points and setting their own little pins in the map and putting their mark on the field, so to speak. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, about the politics of turning points.
No, it's a great question, and clearly in identifying a new turning point, which we all do all the time, there's a will to power gesture there. It's a way to empower us to start shaking up the existing knowledge and putting our own fingerprints over the knowledge is there. But it's interesting why, as you were saying that, I was wondering why are turning points so effective at that? I mean, why, particularly I think for us in our generation of scholars, why discovering new stabilities doesn't give us that sort of, the discovery of stasis doesn't empower us to do a great deal, but the discovery of a new turning point allows us to say all sorts of new things that we couldn't say before, and to enable us to go back to the text. And it's interesting why is that particular metaphor, a way of thinking about temporality, so attractive, but also so effective as a mode of intervening in existing scholarly discourses in a way that other kinds of metaphors aren't.
I mean, I think this political question is really fascinating, and I think it's intimately related to one of Jayanti's points about this sort of let me make sure I use the right language. Oh yes, the notion of absenting, what needs to be absented in order to talk about continuity or discontinuity, for that matter. And I think that there's a kind of politics of memory, of course, but there's also a politics of forgetting. And this makes me think of, there's a book from about 10 or so years ago collecting essays on something called agnotology, which is the study of the active production of ignorance. And this is coming out of looking at things like the strategies that tobacco companies use to sow confusion about whether cigarettes cause cancer or not, which was intended to generate ignorance, essentially. Like, it was pretty clear that that cigarettes did cause cancer, and then the tobacco companies got into it and delayed a wide understanding of that by decades by creating ignorance actively. And we see the same thing happen, of course, with climate change, which involved a kind of direct genealogical connection between those two efforts of generating ignorance. These are quite sinister examples of the generation of ignorance, but I think we can generalize that, what Jayanti calls absenting, that we need to prevent certain things from being visible in order to see other things. And this can have a kind of negative quality of kind of erasure or aggression, but it also can have a kind of positive or creative quality. And I think the will to power is a very nice thing to bring in, because that's, for Nietzsche, that's neither good or bad, it's just necessary. I mean, it's essentially to live or to think is to have that will to power on some level. And so I think maybe it's a matter of bringing into consciousness the politics of these sort of things. And I was struck by, I mean, Michael, there may be a sort of micro-generational thing going on here, because I've actually had an affinity for continuity arguments, which I think may be a kind, you were talking about the sort of, your kind of training was to react against easy narratives of continuity. And my training may be to react against easy narratives of discontinuity. So I tend to bristle at the idea that the Meiji period is a break between Edo and something modern that followed it, or that the beginning of the Edo period is a break between something crude and medieval and something early modern that followed it. So I find, and of course we should allow for personal predilection also here perhaps, but I actually don't prefer to find breaks necessarily, which I know is ironic since I just talked about the 12th century as a kind of break, but.
I'd like to continue David's mea culpa and say I too I'm see continuities, but I think it's partly because, to answer the question of politics, I'll try to answer it two ways. One of them is that the politics of literary history tend towards evolution, that the very questions we're asking in literary history are all about evolution of forms. So at that scale and with that anchoring point, I think we inevitably end up seeing continuity. But at the same time, as a student of medieval literature, on the ground, literature actually fails to mark a turning point. So on the ground, literature is invested in depicting continuity. It's using previous idioms, and as I've been trying to argue with the medieval period, it's all about layering on the past. But that layering of the past into the present, takes many different forms. So it could be this filter of to look at the 15th century through this very rosy, hallowed picture of the past. But if I have time later, I'd like to speak to this another metaphor of ruins, which is a ruin by its, there's a lot of scholarship, and the medieval period is all about ruins. And so to maybe look at that as a productive site that hints at that tries to mark a break within literature, tries to mark a break while preserving a kind of continuity. So maybe we'll come to that later.
Would like to, the ruins idea sounds really interesting, but I want to just follow up a little bit on the notion of absentia that you raised, because sometimes we have our own ideas of connections or ruptures, trying to find turning points. But sometimes we do that by just kind of shifting a perspective. So I was writing for AAS on Sanyute Enjo's Kaidan Botan Doro, which is a work that is very made famous through the shorthand transcription, Sokki. But that Sokki only records about 6 years of his active life as a performer. And there is, in terms of Kaidan Botandoro, a 23 years of performance history. What do we do if we can bring back those 23 years worth of embodied acts and so on into the interpretation? And I think that something like that shows a very, very different picture. So I think in connecting that to absentia, it's really the text that kind of starts to overshadow things that came before. And related to that, I thought Michael's idea of using translation as a term for thinking about continuity, discontinuity, I thought was really interesting, because it is a term that shows a connection to things that came before, but also reiterated in a different way. So it also works well with the notion of layering that Jayanti mentioned. So if you don't mind, can you talk a little bit more about your idea of translation in your new book, which we all are looking forward to reading?
I use the term loosely, and again, I was just experimenting with different words. I mean, trying to think about how to describe. How to describe what I think is a radically new property system that nonetheless incorporates elements of inheritance and other practices that were pre-existing, but are now becoming parts of a different sort of system or a different game. Game pieces have been inherited, but are now being used in a different game with different rules. The translation seemed, again, I was thinking at the level of metaphor. a metaphor for trying to describe that persistence of something in a new system. I don't have any. It's again, I was using the term pretty loosely. And may eventually regret having chosen that term, but yeah. So that was my thought. The point that the people have been made. I mean, what we're dealing with is the retention of the past, whether in the form of runes, whether in the forms of text, is always a selective process that Sanjay Encho's performances, the text gets preserved, the shorthand text gets preserved, but the embodied performances for decades, disappear behind that act of preservation. And I think this is also something Jayanti is clearly looking at, is this. The preservation of the past in the present is always a selective process, and we as scholars are constantly in the position of discovering that process of selection and realizing that a selection has been made, and then trying to figure out then what do you do, what do you do? And David's instance of quoting Norinaga on his predecessors, which is again is this acknowledgement of the past, but again completely selective. And clearly one of the gestures of what we're calling a turning point here is an increased awareness of the nature of the selections that have been made, and that always implies the possibility of other selections that could have been made, and allows us to again return to the same objects with a different set of questions.
I think that that's a really productive way to move the discussion forward, because I think we can think in terms of broadly two kinds of selection, and there's a sort of selection that can't be undone, and a selection that can be undone. And the former is a matter of survival, the latter is a matter of attention. So we can, the 6 years of Seokgibon, there's no equivalent access to the other 20 odd years of Encho. I mean, by the same token, there's a bunch of monogatari that survive only as titles or as waka that are collected in other texts. And maybe someone has some box in a kura somewhere, but fundamentally speaking, we're never going to get access to those texts. Those are lost forever. And those were selected for destruction in a kind of inadvertent way by people who chose not to copy them widely in the way that the Issei Monogatari, the Genji Monogatari, or a host of other texts that were copied, perhaps not as assiduously as the Issei or the Genji, but were still kind of singled out for copying in a way that these Monogatari were not. I mean, on the edges, there's chance, of course, but as a general kind of principle, we can see this. So even if it's not a deliberate absenting in the sense of burning a book, there's a sort of selection process that can't be undone, that these texts don't survive anymore. And then there's the issue of attention. So if we have a narrative that the Edo period is a transition to print, then we just don't pay attention to all of the manuscripts that are circulating in the Edo period. But as long as we're not actively throwing them away, other scholars can come along and say, wait a second, there was a lot of manuscript circulating in the Edo period, and there's room to change the attention and pay attention to something differently. So I think there's a kind of turning point that's in some way baked into what survives, and that may be where we could introduce the notion of ruin. And then there's another kind of turning point, which is an artifact of our sort of scholarly construction of models. And these two, of course, are intertwined and meshed together. And of course, since, as I'm saying, something of the creation of the ruin of the Heian Monogatari tradition was related to decisions about attention on the part of who was copying or preserving or commenting on texts, ultimately it's not a separation that can be maintained. Like these two are going to fall together at some point. But I think heuristically it might be worth thinking about the difference between these two types of turning point, or two types of discontinuity. I'm not sure what vocabulary, what metaphor to use.
Just to build on that, I think to me, there is not a clear difference between what can be undone and what cannot be undone, because it also, even the things that seem like it cannot be undone, it's because we limit ourselves to certain evidence and materials and objects to tell a certain kind of a story, a history, or a cultural histories. And so by shifting our methodology, there could be things that we could pick up to tell that story. And that, I think, connects with what Jayanti was mentioning earlier, that if you're looking at no plays as a historical material or a historical text, or as a literary work, there are certain things that become visible to you. So just wanted to add that.
I'd like to sort of connect what the two of you are saying to sort of recovery. So I don't know if I'm going to get to my point about ruins, but I am right now reading Susan Klein's book. And in it, I see this really fraught negotiation with something that has been lost and has to be reconstructed through dense commentarial tradition, right? That the commentarial layer both helps, and I mean, I hope that can connect to what David Lurie studies, that the commentarial layer or the philological layer that happens in commentaries are both both provide that bridge to a language or understanding that was lost, but so it's a recovery, but also mark that thing. If it's behind that many layers, it is lost, folks. That sense of that great distance you perceive when it's something, it comes to you through dense commentarial layers. So I don't know, David, if you want to take that.
I mean, I absolutely agree. It's the logic of the supplement. I mean, there's the commentary is adding, it's superfluous and it's adding, but it's also responding to a lack within, and thus it's not superfluous. So that's absolutely true. But I also think, if I can kind of continue in the sort of Derridian vein for a moment longer, that this is kind of, you can also see ways in which this goes all the way down. I mean, if you look at a text like the Manyoshu already contains commentary inside itself. And I think that we can look at a lot of literary works that way, even texts where it's not as obvious. I mean, in the Manyoshu, there are sort of different fields on the page where there's a kind of clear kind of paratextual marking, but I think you can make similar arguments for a lot of other genres where that's not as obvious. But I mean, going back to Satoko, I think that Satoko's wonderful point that we don't have to, we shouldn't be as pessimistic as perhaps I was being, and talking about the sort of turning points that can't be undone, or the sort of losses that can't be undone. I think that's a really important point, and that I tend to sort of think about, sometimes with jealousy, sometimes with pity, of the fact that early modern and modern people have so much more they have to deal with, just in terms of the quantity of material. But it's all about imagination wherever you are, and there's the lack is only a lack if you are unable to imagine a way around it, ultimately. So I think that's a very inspiring, Satoko's intervention there is something that we should all take to heart.
I thought, David, in your discussion too, you presented a really good instance of that. I mean, I love the way that you framed. So we have monogatari that no longer exist anymore, and in a certain sense, that's just an absence, and there's nothing we can do with it. But you already started to do something with it by saying what this tells us is there were choices made in the past, that people chose not to copy this, to circulate this manuscript widely. And in a certain sense, you were giving us a wonderful instance of the way that we can use imagination. So all we have is the absence of a certain text, but actually that absence already start suggesting some, we can start find some thingness in there as choices that were made, and we've already started reconstructing actually the absence of that text as actually a significant historical event that we can then start to unpack in ways that I think Satoko was suggesting.
Oh, thank you. Although I do want to just say, I think that can be taken too far. You can have a kind of Whig historical approach where you sort of say the bad texts all got lost and the good ones all got preserved. And I don't want to imply that that's what I was thinking, but on some level, I think, yeah, we can see that as produced by choices and not just by chance. Which, yeah, I agree with you. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that opens up a certain kind of historical window for historical inquiry or historical speculation.
I should share that I deeply related to that remark, both what Satoko and David had to say, because the no plays I'm looking at that are legal dramas are for the most part outside the 250 that were selected. So they were consigned to the afterthought, right? They were popular in their own time. They just never became that popular in the Edo period. So I'm looking at the most part at Bangai no. But so this brings up this really interesting question of, as we start to recover, as Satoko says, the things that are left out, or we're in the process of recovering the things that are left out, we do get to these new literary histories, the new vantage points on these forms. If I wanted to make another connection with what Michael. So to sort of talk about ruins, because I see so many sort of the metaphorical use of ruins in medieval drama, and maybe connect to what Michael said at the very beginning about writing in the national frame as a kind of memorialization, as a kind of taking. To give it that place that it is at risk of losing. I don't know if I'm actually going to make that connection. It sounded like I could make it when I first started speaking about it. But yeah, I think a lot of interesting work is being done recently among medieval literature scholars, conceptualizing this. Conceptualizing the relationship of the past and present, either through the figure of the ghost or the ruin, there's one way in which you look at the ghost as a kind of irascible other that threatens historical continuity. This is Jian's view. He threatens the ghost threatens historical continuity, so he or she must be mentioned, but it remains other. And in Takeshi Watanabe's recent book, it was very interesting to read how he speaks of ghosts as something that need to be integrated into genealogies to sort of evoke continuity and to sort of preserve the social fabric. I think he even goes that far. But he also gestures to the fact that ghosts are a necessary figure during periods of historical transition. And so, but I'm also seeing other works by scholars, young junior scholars who are thinking about ghosts as, how should I say this? So instead of seeing ghosts like hermeneutically as signs to be decoded, seeing them rather deconstructively as gaps that destroy coherence. And I think, that sort of interesting, that work is bringing up really interesting questions about how ghosts help mark continuity or discontinuity for the medieval world. And likewise, ruins. And here I'm thinking of Elizabeth Euler's work and Roberto's work on monuments. And because these no-play ghosts visit the ruins of battlefields. But what happens when something remains, but in this fragmented form? Is that, a signaling for a connection, a yearning for reuniting with the past, or is it kind of a sealing of the past into the past? What kind of temporal imaginations do these? What is the rhetoric of temporality in such no place? So I'm afraid I didn't actually make that connection to memorialization, which I do think is a different kind of temporal move. But I'll pause here.
I mean, I think that the introducing this notion of ghosts or haunting makes me think about the kind of topological metaphors or the implicit topological metaphors we've been using. I mean, if we talk about hinges or filters, there's a kind of implicit one-dimensional model where there's a sort of movement through time on a line, and the turning point, it literally is a point on a line. And maybe we can imagine that line in three-dimensional space where the line bends at the point. But the image of the ghost or haunting that makes me think more of a kind of point on a plane or in a sort of three-dimensional space that is sort of, whether it's a gap or, I mean, I guess it's either a black hole or a white hole. It's either something that things are going into or something that things are coming out of. And I don't want to go too far into this kind of dimensional speculation, but I wonder if that's twisting the turning point, or, I mean, where does that leave us? Is there a way to kind of integrate these different sort of spatial imaginations, or do we want to hold on to the linearity of one way of conceptualizing a turning point, even if that's not the only way?
I mean, as you were speaking about a point on a plane, I was thinking about a broken line, a kind of,
Like a dot?
Yeah. So, as opposed to seeing two parallel lines, which is the layering or filter metaphor, a break, a gap, and then that starts sort of a new potential, new line.
To bring in an utterly anachronistic Meiji period discourse. I mean, you're talking about the difference between a melancholic relationship to a rune and a mourning, a relationship of mourning to whether one is unable to separate, one internalizes the loss that the rune represents, or whether one reconstitutes the ego precisely by expelling the rune from the self and moving on, which is a model for discontinuity. And maybe as the speaker, as David pointed out, we have microgenerations represented here, and as the representative of the discontinuity generation in Japanese literary studies, that there were powerful reasons sometimes to want to effect a break, for political, ethical, and other reasons. I'm always William Haver's book, The Body of His Death on AIDS, has this wonderful phrase talking about a certain kind of political and ethical sense is how to get to a future that is not continuous with the present. How to imagine a world that is not continuous with our own world, even as we couldn't possibly say anything about that world because it's discontinuous from us. But that utopian possibility, which drives I think a lot of political and ethical projects, is inherently a project of discontinuity, a project of trying to imagine what a break would actually look like. It is also, I mean, again, in thinking about turning points, it's fraught with all sorts of problems, as everyone knows. But it also retains an attractive and powerful force that can be very useful in times and places. And so the rune, I mean, is a wonderful place, because as you analyze the two ways that one can respond to a rune, one can see oneself as continuous with the loss that the rune represents, and as one's sort of stuck in that moment of inability to overcome the loss, or one can see oneself as overcoming the loss represented by the rune to move into a discontinuous, different world.
That reminds me of this passage from Tanizaki that I always use in my undergraduate survey lectures about the aftermath of the earthquake, where I don't remember where he was, but he was not in the Kansai, so he wasn't directly affected. But when he hears the news of the sort of destruction of most of Tokyo and Yokohama, he has this kind of ecstatic response where he kind of has this immediate vision of the sort of hyper modern kind of European style decadent future city that will spring up on the ruins of the old Tokyo. And I wonder, I mean, I'm congenitally very much averse to making claims about things that are modern that don't happen in the pre-modern. But I'm wondering if any of us can think of responses to catastrophe that involve envisioning a great future in pre-modern literature. Because Michael, while you were speaking, I was trying to think about that, and it's very, very hard. At least it's hard for me, which may just be my own ignorance at work or failure of imagination. But I'm curious if anyone else can think of a case where, confronted with a kind of catastrophic moment, the response is to imagine a kind of glorious future. I mean, if you think about disasters like the Genpei Wars or earthquakes or famines, think about the Hojoki. If you think about Stomato's poems on the ruined Omi capital, I mean, I could go on, but I can't think of a case where someone has that sort of response. And I think you're absolutely right that that's a very prevalent response after a certain, I don't want to say turning point, but after a certain point, it becomes in the kind of repertoire of how one responds to catastrophe. And I just read a really melancholy article, I don't remember where, interviewing a number of Japanese kind of critics and sort of people on the left, talking about how they sort of envisioned that there would be a kind of new world after 3/11, and lamenting the fact that the change that they thought would be occurring 10 years ago has not happened over the past decade. But the fact that there was this sort of sense like, okay, here's our chance to, exactly as you say, maybe finally we can fix some things, that doesn't seem like a pre-modern reflex, but maybe I'm just not, maybe it's my failure of imagination. I'm really curious what the other three I say pre-Meiji scholars here think about that.
You know what? One thing I think about, like in the way, for instance, how the Genpei War is treated, there's a considerable focus on the Heike side. But then when you get to Edo, like Edo Kabuki, Seiwa Genji becomes much more important. So there is a kind of, there are periods when presentism is so much more given emphasis. And so I'm not directly responding to what you mentioned, because I'm still thinking, but I was also thinking how, in a way, we don't have to think in a linear narrative, but I think there is an impulse in different moments when different communities take over power to kind of absorb the ghost of the past. So even when you get into the Meiji period, Heian literature was supposed to be for a very small community of people, but now it becomes for everyone, right? And most of the people, if you go back, they were farming or not living in Kyoto. But so there is that kind of transition that is happening at the level of community building at the higher level, and I do feel that that's a place where you start seeing the past as a ghost or something being absorbed, and as something that can be digested and productive for the present.
Great question, David. As soon as you sort of threw out the question, I started thinking about how what are the metaphors of futurity in medieval texts, and often it is dreams. So dream texts, Jian in Musoki, trying to imagine a new future through dreams. but also salvific aspiration. I think salvific aspiration figures as a vision of futurity. And I would love to see, thoughts around the kind of the way in which salvific aspirations either fold the future into the present or break from as Michael said, break from the present to imagine a future. And then my last thought was about plays like Jinen Koji, that treat slavery. I know, Reggie is now starting to think about how the embodied the embodiment of an outcast body then allows us, if we approach the no place through that, then is it, are such no plays imagining, I hope I'm not misparaphrasing him. I'm very sorry if I do, but a kind of a futurity of a liberatory future for these outcast performers.
Yeah, I had the same thought about salvational discourses, but it also struck me that we're probably, the difficulty in finding these moments also tells us something about the selectivity of the canon, that peasant uprisings and other sort of utopian moments tend not to be canonized once they're suppressed. And that would be the place, the first place that you would go looking for sort of that sort of utopian future gesture, but it wouldn't be accepted into a literary canon.
I think if I may take the question too, sorry. So as a pre-modernist, one thing I think that may, at least this is my tentative idea, prevent that kind of future imagination before the 20th century is the way that people conceived of themselves in relation to groups and as belonging to a particular lineage, for instance. If there's a catastrophe, people are very invested in their sense of past, at least people of a certain status, whether they're aristocrats or warriors. So by contrast, once you get into, say, if we're talking about 311, it's the imagination of the future isn't tied to a kind of sense of lineage or collective group throughout history to the same degree, I think. So at least that sort of is a little bit liberating, I think, or allows people to imagine different worlds in which people, I think we're living through one of those moments right now, with this summer, with the Black Lives Matter protests and things like that, where people want to imagine a different way, a different kind of communities, right? And they're not, well, some people are very invested in existing types of communities, of course, but I don't see that kind of moment in pre-modern times, except for possibly in the sort of late medieval kind of slight breakdown, where it seems to be kind of chaotic, whether they're not really visions of the future per se, but they're sort of visions of some kind of chaos. I don't know. I mean, Jayanti would know a lot more about that period, I think. But so yeah, it's true that I don't see this kind of vision of the future. And I should note that the other roundtable actually talks about the future quite a lot. In particular, Will Bridges discusses this quite a lot on the other panel.
Do you think this is because of how the past, present, and future as categories, they seem clear cut to us, but maybe that's not as clear. I was thinking, since you mentioned 311, remember reading the New York Times op-eds by Japanese writers, Takahashi Genichiro, Oe Kenzaburo, and they all went back to the post-war moment. So then using the past to understand the present, and talking about the future, you could also think about future invested with nostalgia for a home that one never has. But it's true that you don't really see that in the pre-modern context. I wonder if that's in part due to also how past, present, and future is demarcated or not even understood in that clear terms.
I mean, I'm trying to connect this back to our basic question of a turning point, and what does a turning point, as Satoko just said so eloquent. I mean, we have this common sense notion of past, present, future. We know what they mean. So a turning point, that's easy. It's how the present is the hinge between the past and the future. It's implicit in our notion of what a turning point is. And if it's, and I'm still thinking of some other early modern works, but if our common sense notion of the future is very much a modern notion of the future and that relationship of past, present, and future is very much of our own era. Then so is our concept of a turning point. It is already, unless there's a way to think of a turning point without some implicit notion of a future connected to it, is that itself an anachronistic category that we're thinking about here, or are there different ways we could think about what the turning point is?
I mean, this is it's really striking that we've headed in this direction. And I mean, I think that I've been thinking about for years about people who make kind of strong claims about when sort of science fiction emerges. And I've recently done some work on the Urashimataro, the origins of the Urashimataro story in the 8th century. And it's really striking that there's a lot of time travel traditionally moving forward into the future, but not time travel moving back into the past. That seems to be a much more recent kind of conceptual generation. Although, of course, talking about ruins and the kind of imaginary kind of inhabiting of the past, which is the fundamental kind of interaction with the literary classic, is something that's absolutely pervasive. So it to some extent, it's an issue of a definition of what we mean when we're talking about time travel into the past. But there's a very interesting genre of Miraiki, which is something that I know Jayanti comes across a lot in the text that she works with. And there's a kind of weird temporal sleight of hand that takes place when these texts are narrated in a literary context, which is they're usually records of the future that are found at a certain point in a narrative, which is a narrative of the past. So that record of the future that is narrating the future at the moment in the narrative is actually narrating the past of the audience of the narrative in the present, so that there's this sort of, you get to enjoy the kind of speculation about a future which is in your past so that you already know about it. And I think this is a kind of undersung effect of the historical narrative. I mean, since the pandemic started, I've been reading Bakin, and the Hakkenden is full of all this play with place names that are deeply redolent to the resident of Edo, that are just absolutely nothing places in the 15th century when the Hakkenden is set. And so the Bakin is kind of playing with the sort of anachronistic vibe that his readers, his Edo period readers, will get from reading about this landscape, which is empty in the 15th century sort of setting. And so I think these sort of temporal, these anachronisms or these kind of temporal breaks are really related to this sort of issue of turning points. This is a kind of area where literary works are kind of figuring this kind of temporality in a way that scholars do on a kind of different level and in a different way. But I think there are sort of some structural parallels of kind of anachronism and of sort of predicting the future, or of selecting certain when you're talking about the past entirely, you're selecting certain kind of futures for the past moment. But I also think that there's a genre issue here, which Jayanti's point about the sort of salvific attention to the future, it really brings to the fore, because there's also a lot of prognostication going on in military texts, and in kind of one aspect of military, sort of the military arts is looking at omens and telling the future. And of course, there's a lot of non-military focus on omens and telling the future. And so I think this is another area that would be very interesting. I'd be delighted if someone or some group of people brought forward papers talking about this kind of predicting the future or thinking about the future as a way of thinking about turning points.
So unfortunately, we're drawing up to the 2-hour mark. This is a good point, I think, to end on. Bringing us up to science fiction is definitely a fitting point. So I'd like to conclude this discussion by noting that the AJLS at UCLA will take place in the spring of 2022. We have to determine the exact date, and that the deadline for applications will be September 1st of this year. We will announce this more formally in the AJLS newsletter and on the conference website. I'd like to encourage everyone to also watch the other roundtable, which is moderated by my colleague, Michael Emmerich, and which features Sherilyn Orbo, Seiji Lippett, Mimi Long, and Will Bridges. And while the main purpose of these roundtables is to serve as a call for papers for the AJLS conference, we also hope that they are of interest to those who are not necessarily going to attend. But I should also note that we hope to make some part of the UCLA conference, AJLS conference, available in a virtual online format. I'd like to thank all 4 of our speakers today for a fascinating discussion: Michael Bordash, Satoko Shimazaki, Jayanti Selinger, and David Lurie. And thank you for watching. Goodbye for now.